Well, hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you to my channel. If you're new here, I grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia, without any help from grow lights or greenhouses or humidifiers, really just me and them battling it out inside or outside or not at all. So plant lovers of the world, if that sounds like your conditions on your bag, hit subscribe. I post every week on a Friday and I am a complete amateur. And look what my amateur ramblings have brought forth. Look at this glorious orchid. Without further ado, let me tell you what this glorious creature is. And according to the label, it is Panerea prismatocarpa. But is it? As ever, in the complex world of orchid nomenclature, this orchid goes under many synonyms. But Q, the great authority of all naming, now says that it is Prosthechea prismatocarpa. It's also been called an encyclia as well. It's one of those orchids that just bats around from one family home to the next. But anyway, Q is now calling it Prosthechea. So that is what we will call it. And just because we love our nomenclature, Prosthechea comes from the Greek prostheke, perhaps how you pronounce it, which means appendage, and that's to do with something at the back of the column of the flower, too botanical for me. And the prismatocarpa means that the seed pods are prism shaped and have three sides. So there you go. Prosthechea prismatocarpa 101. But now let's just give you a view of the plant. Look, it is a scrambler, a rambler, and a rhizomous little baby. Quite similar habit, actually, just looking at it, to Miltonias. Can you see? Now, don't be alarmed by this pseudobulb. That is a very old one, and in all of these plants that I've seen, you get sort of successive growth like this, and then the old original pseudobulbs shrivel and just disappear. Anyway, so I'm not alarmed by that. So let's calm our nerves should you think, oh my goodness, that bulb's rotting. So this orchid is quite high altitude, and it comes from literally the very central bit of Central America, Costa Rica and Panama, and it grows in quite high altitude, quite wet sort of montane forests where it gets medium amount of light. But imagine that is a very moist, humid, cloudy kind of place. So although it might get quite strong light, there's often a lot of cloud cover protecting it. So bright light and bright light can mean different things depending on the cloud cover. So one of those orchids that does need a little bit of protection and not too much fierce light. And once again, because it is one of those sort of high altitude, misty, mountainy orchids, like many from the Himalaya and from the Andes, it does really well in Melbourne. Look at that. It's just burst into bloom for me without much effort. So growing so high, it means it can take cold winter and nighttime minimums. And I've had this outside all year. So it dealt with winter. Quite cold here in Melbourne. I mean, it doesn't get to freezing, 0 centigrade or 32 Fahrenheit that often in the city centre. Not in the last sort of 5 years for me here anyway. It can get quite close, you know, the 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees centigrade. So that's the high 30s, low 40s Fahrenheit. But it doesn't freeze, nor do we get frosts in the inner city, which is where I am. And so this orchid can sail through it. The trick, of course, with generally cold temperatures and orchids, even though they are cold tolerant, is not to get them wet or keep them wet on those very cold nights. So this one is elevated outside and it's getting bright indirect light, but protection from the rain so that I can control the water that it's getting in winter to make sure it's not too wet. Now, look at that flower. It's absolutely beautiful. Now, this is a species orchid, so it's as it's found in the wild. And for a species flower, that's really quite something, don't you think? Absolutely amazing, but we'll get to the flowers in a minute. So we've looked at where I'm growing it outside. You might also observe, plant lovers, it is in a black plastic pot. Not my ideal method of potting orchids, because I bought this at an auction of an orchid society I belong to, the Orchid Species Society of Victoria. I'll put the link below. Again, not that you need any encouragement. One of the reasons why you should try and find an orchid group or club near you and join it is that they A, often have plant sales, and B, often have auctions, and C, members often bring plants to sell at each meeting. So it's a great place to find unusual orchids that you don't normally find on online selling sites, but also orchids that people are growing in your area, so you know that they can survive and thrive, and you can ask advice about how someone's growing it. So once again, should you need any reason why you need to Google immediately orchid groups near me, is because you get the chance to buy plants like this. So this one was at last last Christmas, I think, so maybe a year ago. Can't quite remember now. Anyway, it was an auction at one of the meetings and I saw this. It wasn't in bloom, but I Googled it and I saw the flower and thought, oh, I cannot live without this orchid. So I did just keep bidding. It wasn't terribly expensive though. I mean, generally orchids at those clubs aren't. So it wasn't a huge price, but I've just never seen it for sale. And it is an absolute beauty. Very happy to have made it mine, and I'm very happy that it is decided to flower for me. Now, curiously enough, last night was the monthly meeting of the Orchid Species Society of Victoria, and lo and behold, quite a few people had specimens of this on the bench, showing everyone how fabulous their specimen plants were. And I must say, many of the spikes were bigger than this and had more blooms per spike, and the plants obviously were a bit bigger and more vigorous. However, I am not concerned about that because this was clearly a division that I was able to buy, and so my plant's going to need a few years to kind of ramp up. And also because I bought it, actually it wasn't a year ago, I bought it in winter, so about 6 months ago. Because I bought it in winter, I didn't want to repot it because it's basically kind of in stasis and not doing anything. So I just kind of left it as it was. So I didn't really do much to the medium. I didn't really fertilize it much, haven't really done much to it. And ta-da, there we go. So I feel that next year, hopefully, I should have possibly a better result with the flowers. Anyway, nonetheless, I am still really thrilled that it's bloomed for me this time. And so what I will do, once this flower has finished, I will repot it. And as you can see, that habit is quite a tricky one. It's a bit of a scrambler and a climber. So I'm going to sort of lay it in more of a bonsai dish, I think, so that it's got more room to kind of spread around. The great thing is that, firstly, we've got a new growth here. So as you can see, it's blooming from last season's matured growth. But what you might be able to see there is another growth emerging. So I'm going to have 2 growth points, which means I could have, hopefully, 2 flowers next year because it's going to bloom from each matured pseudobulb. So with many orchids, that is the name of the game, vegetative growth. And with this one, to try and get as many growth points as possible, because then you'll get multiple flower spikes. Now, in the wild, of course, well, not of course, but I think about 75% of orchids are epiphytes, and this one is part of that average. It is an epiphyte, and at the moment it is in actually quite a small bark and a mix of perlite and some little terracotta beads. So a bit of a mix in there. I will probably, when I repot it, put it in medium bark pieces with large perlite and maybe with a bit of sphagnum moss as well. It does come from a fairly moist area, does like to be moist during the growing season, so spring, summer, early autumn. But then as we get into winter, it does want to dial down a little bit on the water, but not one of those orchids that has a dry dormancy period. It comes from somewhere that's consistently moist, but it does get less moisture. And as I'm quite cold here, certainly it will get less. But I will water it, I just won't water it that often. And in fact, it sailed through my last winter, getting, moderate amounts of water on warmer, breezy days, so that it wasn't kind of cold and wet at night. And then what I do with most things is slow release fertilizer in the mix when I repot anything, and a topical application in spring of slow release granules. And then throughout the warmer growing season, I mix it up with basically liquid fertilizers, and they can be fertilizers that are aimed specifically at orchids or general flowering plant fertilizers, or sometimes a tonic, which is actually not a fertilizer, it's just full of botanical gorgeousness. And that can take the form of a seaweed-based solution or the juice from a worm farm, all of which I dilute sort of 1/8, 1/10 the recommended dose. So it's sort of very much on the weaker strength because you don't want to overfeed your plants. And this one has been benefiting from that regime, although it didn't get topical slow-release fertilizer. So far, it's only been getting liquid fertilizers. So it probably will do well from a little bit of oomph in its mix when I repot it. Now, we don't really talk humidity here on my channel, Plant Lovers, because I don't really deal with it. It's either inside or outside. So it's either the ambient humidity in the house or the ambient humidity outside. However, it can get quite hot and dry in summer. So I do just spray about with a hose in the morning and in the evening if it's really warm, so that there's generally sort of moisture in the air. And in the house, I feel that with showers and steam and cooking, the interior humidity is actually quite good. Again, though, in summer I do have a misting can for inside orchids, but this one lives outside all year, and so it benefits from a bit of a misty hose on warm summer days. And in winter I can mist orchids because it can get quite dry climatically in winter and cold, but just not on a particularly cold, overcast day, because again, you just don't want moisture nestling in any of the nooks and crannies of these orchids, because it can be a recipe for disaster in cold weather. Now then, let's look at the flower. It's sort of leopard print, isn't it? They're sort of like a very, very pale lemon flower. Let me try and get one close. There you are. With these beautiful spots of sort of burgundy, and then this splash of pink on the lip. It's really beautiful. And actually, the flower reminds me a bit of some of those species, fragrant Phalaenopsis. It kind of looks a bit similar, doesn't it? Anyway, very, very beautiful. And quite a few flowers on the spike. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. As I said, though, last night I happened to see 2 specimens, all with multiple spikes, and I think a few more flowers per spike. Anyway, as I said, I am not envious. I'm just really happy it survived the winter and it's flowered for me. But now, a lot of Encyclias, which are still Encyclias, are quite fragrant, but this one, no, not a hint of a fragrance. But you know what? The flower is so beautiful, need we worry? So I think, as you can see, quite a relatively easy orchid to divide. You quite simply chop up your rhizome and pop them on, and then encourage each of those bits to develop new growth. I'm not really in the dividing stage yet. I do like the idea of specimen plants, and the ones that I saw last night were in quite wide, shallow pans and just brimming with life and flowers. That is my aim. Now, according to the books, this is an orchid that blooms in spring or early summer, and ta-da, it is early summer. And in fact, the flower has been out for quite some time, actually, at least a month. So it actually did come out in late spring. And a long-lasting flower. I mean, not unlike sort of Cattleya blooms in terms of the fact that it can last quite long. Very, very strong stem and beautiful flowers which are going to hang around for quite some time. So a beautiful thing. I'm so looking forward to really growing this on, getting quite a large specimen plant and getting multiple growths and multiple flower heads in time. So what you can see, let's just look at the growth habit. We've got this quite stemmy rhizome, so very, very similar to Miltonias, and then you get a new growth emerging from the base of the old one, and in this case I've got a second one coming here, which is making me very excited. And then you can kind of see, where can you see best? There, maybe. You can just see the progress of each new growth as this rhizome expands. So, looks though it could be a bit tricky, doesn't it, to actually pot and manage. But anyway, when I do come to repot, I'm going to chop off these old back bulbs. I might even just pop them on like a cymbidium and just see if it bears any fruit, but I should just be planting up off. And as you can see, each new growth produces new roots, and these are very active. Can you see there's very green tips? So they're the ones that are really going to be drawing in all the moisture and nutrients for the plant. So I'll certainly trim off some of the back of the plant. But there we are. Prosthechea prismatocarpa. Well, there we are, plant lovers. Thank you very much for watching. I do hope you have enjoyed this. I'm loving this orchid. I'm just loving the kind of mad tropicalness of that bloom. It's just stunning, isn't it? Imagine coming across that in the highlands of Panama and Costa Rica. Your heart would just skip a beat, wouldn't it? It's just stunning. Anyway, thank you for bearing with my ramblings. If you want to know what they are next week, you'll have to hit subscribe, because I post every week on a Friday. And I hope wherever you are, all is well, that your orchid world is blooming and fabulous, and I look forward to seeing you next week.